Hey guys, what is up? Chris here with Cohesive Friendship Unit. Just me today. I've been having a lot of free time at home lately, like I'm sure a lot of you have, and that's given me a chance to revisit and think about some older games. And I was thinking about the original Legend of Zelda and thinking about what might have even inspired that game. We always talk about the Legend of Zelda as being a stepping stone, a breakthrough point for video games, but I wanted to go even further back and talk about a game that I think maybe inspired The Legend of Zelda. And I'm going to try to draw a lot of parallels and comparisons between the two and give some credit to a game that is not recognized maybe as much as it should be anymore. But before we get into that, we are doing a giveaway. We're super close to giving away a copy of Risk of Rain 2 on your platform of choice. All you got to do is be subscribed. We would really appreciate the support. So I want to talk about what the first Zelda is kind of lauded for. Talk about why we think of the first game in such high praise when it comes to pioneering newer, more innovative games later down the line. And I think it's important to think about the first Zelda as an open world exploration game that allowed you to go into non-linear levels or dungeons. I mean, you have to think of really even the top Nintendo games like Super Mario Bros. That's a linear game which you can intentionally break and skip levels, but that's more due to hardware restrictions than anything. This was an open world game. You could go not just right, you could go left, right, up, down. You could go wherever you want, however you wanted to go there, and you could go into other levels. Not necessarily all of them from the get-go, but there were dungeons scattered across the overworld. That's kind of like dropping Mario into a warp pipe zone at the beginning of the game. Like, you start a Super Mario World game and there's just 8 warp pipes, and you get to go in the ones that you want. And this open world exploration into non-linear levels or dungeons is something that games are still trying to get right, but the original Zelda is given a lot of credit for doing just that. And then I want to talk about what those dungeons comprise of. Well, they are, in the original Zelda, fairly simplistic. They are key-driven, puzzle, very simple puzzle, push-block puzzles, but still puzzle-based, and combat driven. You're essentially trying to get through this maze, collect enough essential keys to get to the boss. You collect those keys through combat, and yeah, you're navigating this maze for a win condition, and that win condition is to beat the boss to get a piece of the Triforce and proceed to the next level. Once you have all the pieces of the Triforce, you can go to the final boss. And that kind of picking up items, picking up Triforce pieces that lead you to new levels, etc. It kind of starts to lean into this idea of Metroidvania games where you are picking up items throughout your adventure that will later help you progress. Picking up things like the candle, which will let you burn the bush to get to level 8. Picking up things like the raft, which will let you get to another dungeon, picking up items that allow you to kind of overcome roadblocks later in the game. And the last thing that I think a lot of people give the original Legend of Zelda for credit, not that other games didn't have this, in fact a lot of games had this as a way to pad out their length, and I think the Legend of Zelda is actually kind of criticized for this, is just an unbelievable amount of secrets, and later the series would come to embrace some Easter eggs. But what game do I think could be the predecessor to this? Well, Warren Robinett in 1979 was working for Atari and released his game in 1980, but the game that he was working on was, he was inspired to take command prompt games. Think in 1970, you were rarely seeing true graphics. Usually a lot of the interaction you were doing was just on a command terminal. And a lot of games early on were just that. You would get text given to you and you would be typing in options on how to proceed. And that had some pretty nice experiences. Well, he was inspired to take the command prompt game, specifically Colossal Cave Adventure, and translate those elements into a simple, easy to recognize graphics that the player could control with a controller instead of text-based commands. Instead of typing out move forward 1, swipe sword 1, swipe sword 1, you could use a joystick and the button on the Atari 2600 to have a much more immersive experience. And he was successfully able to construct different rooms for his game. 30 rooms ultimately in the final version of the game, at a time when most games were only taking place on a single screen. Usually something like a Space Invaders takes place on a single screen. Maybe for E.T. you're taking place on a single screen and then you're fading to a different screen, but you're not seamlessly moving through screens like you are in this game. And another example would be Pac-Man. Takes place all on a single screen. So to go from a single screen experience to 30 different rooms is a huge leap. And that game was ultimately Adventure, which released in 1980. And the idea of Adventure is you are in a kingdom with 3 castles and 3 dragons, and you need to collect the things that you need to get a chalice, which is your win condition, and use that chalice to complete the game. Now, he definitely barely had graphics. Your playable character is literally a dot, and the dragons look more like chickens, but I do want to draw some comparisons on how Adventure from 1980 definitely was an inspiration in part for The Legend of Zelda, or at least pioneered a lot of the things that The Legend of Zelda did. Comparisons, I'm going to go back to what we said about The Legend of Zelda, an open world exploration game into non-linear levels or dungeons. Well, again, in Adventure you are exploring a kingdom like the overworld in The Legend of Zelda to recover a chalice from 3 castles. Those castles would represent the dungeons in Zelda, and the chalice would represent the Triforce in Zelda. So you're exploring an overworld to find 3 different dungeons and get the win condition from those dungeons. Those castles, or again, dungeons, are key driven, and not those keys, not the bats, but much like Zelda, using actual keys to navigate a maze. And there is combat, which are in this case the 3 dragons. And much like I said earlier, the dungeons in the original Zelda, very simple puzzles where you are doing combat and collecting keys to navigate a maze. It's basically the same thing. And the Metroidvania aspect, there aren't a lot of items in Adventure, but you could tell that the idea was there. Unfortunately, there's really only one button on the Atari 2600 controller, so pretty limited as far as having an inventory where you can select things from. Also, this game was really pushing the limits on memory for the Atari 2600, but there are different items. There's the magnet item, which allows you to draw items near you. There's the sword, which you can pick up, which allows you to defeat dragons. And there are keys. There's the chalice, and then there's a secret item for secrets and Easter eggs. So the idea was there for something like a Metroidvania, where you're finding a pitfall, like, oh, I found this dragon, how do I overcome it? Well, you explore the world, and ultimately you find a sword, and then you can take that sword and slay the dragon. Now, of course, Zelda kind of amplified that by saying, oh, you found the sword, you keep the sword, you don't have to carry it around with you and drop it when you don't need it. But it's the early seeds of the idea were there. And the last thing I want to talk about, Adventure is actually credited as being the first game with an Easter egg, because Warren didn't think he was getting enough credit. A lot of times developers' names weren't incorporated in the game itself, and he thought that he deserved kind of a public resume, if you will, by secretly hiding his name in the code, so however many copies the game are sold, his name would appear as a developer of the game. And Zelda, of course, has been no secret to Easter eggs, especially probably most famously known in A Link to the Past, the secret room from the lucky Nintendo Power Sweepstakes winner. And I kind of want to close this with a couple review excerpts on Adventure from the time. So within a year or two of the game releasing, just to show, because I know showing this footage doesn't make it look that impressive, but it really was a pioneering game. Norman Howe reviewed Adventure in Space Gamer. He said, quote, "Adventure is a good game as video games are measured. It is neither as interesting nor as complex as Superman, but it shows great promise for things to come. If you have access to an Atari game computer, it is an entertaining cartridge to have." And in 1981, there's a video game magazine which called Adventure a, quote, "major design breakthrough and shatters several video game conventions such as scoring and time limits." And that's kind of it, right? We give Zelda a lot of credit for doing these things, but there were games and there were thinkers that were working even before Zelda that I think are worth shining some light on. So I hope you found this helpful. That's all, guys. I will catch you next time.